First, thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel and to the conference. Part of that thank you is just a thank you specifically for the opportunity to think about a set of issues that are like super important from a policy point of view. And quite frankly, at best adjacent to where my head and sort of where my organization's head usually is at. So that they're related, and I'll try to use that as a way to share my reactions and questions. Like I tried to like put a frame across these. That was hard, I will say, in part because there's just so much content in the papers. And I feel like discussants always say, I just read a great set of papers. You should also read the papers because the presentations don't do justice to the papers. And I know I'm saying that again here, but I feel like especially here, I think you could even tell as the presenters, we're trying to get all their content into a small amount of time, like how much there is that they weren't able to share. And so I'm not going to try to comment on everything. I'm really just going to try to draw a through line, reflect on my own thought process about them to hopefully spur a set of questions for everyone. So as I said, this is kind of adjacent to what I usually do and even sort of what my colleagues usually do. So for my own benefit, like I had to like scribble on paper a lot to get my head around like, well, how should I think about sort of what's common across all of these? And I have some visual semantics problems here, so just bear with me. But for me, I just have to remind myself that the safety net generally is doing something of the following sort, I think. There's something that happens that detaches people's ability to kind of take what we call sort of like BAU, earned income, that they would usually use to support their own well-being and consumption, right? So there's like lots of kinds of separations that can happen, and I'll sort of talk about some of them. The one that that my team and my colleagues usually think about the most is job separations from layoffs, right? Like your working age, your prime working age, you're going to be going back into the workforce most likely, but you rely on the safety net depicted here to the left when you're sort of temporarily separated from work by a layoff or some such. And there's a huge conversation about what does that mean in recessions? What does that mean in COVID? What did that mean before a recession? And quite frankly, like what are we learning about what this might mean sort of post the current recession, right? So like that's a big conversation. I don't want to dive into that. I'm only trying to illustrate here that this is the way that I usually think about it, right? It's like, okay, like in the very short run, somebody's like losing a job, maybe they're coming back to a job. What does that mean for their well-being? We typically measure that in terms of consumption and have done a lot of work to think about sort of how resilience mitigates that. And our lens on that is typically liquid assets. And so I'm not even going to try to describe this chart. I'm just trying to give this frame because it is a frame that I think I saw applied across all three of the papers, at least in some part. So first, Bob's paper, again, not going to do justice, only going to show like one set of charts here. But I was like, oh, well, here, like, this is another way to think about, or that I could look at the results from the paper. It's like, okay, a different way in which people get separated from this typical way in which earned income and wages would support their well-being, with this conditionality around sort of like, well, how resilient are you? Well, there's lots of ways, and the paper did a great job. Again, one of the reasons I encourage people to read it, to really lay out the differences between the Great Recession and the pandemic recession in terms of a wide variety of safety net programs and how those were implemented in different ways that had different responses. And then does a really good job of showing like for different groups with different resilience, they use education as a way to get at sort of like relatively less resilient families, what the uptake is. And well-being is a little bit downstream of uptake, but fine as a proxy. Like I could see that at least as a through line, where you can see here the difference between what that response of the safety net looked like in the Great Recession as compared to what it looked like in COVID-19. There are these kinds of very detailed charts for each of these programs, which I found really interesting to look at. I can't talk about all of them. I shuffled them around because one of the things I was curious about was like, well, across the groups by race and by, not by race, by gender and by age, still in my own head a little bit, I agree that the effects generally look similar. And I think that was a little bit the point that you see that these programs are important, not just for prime age workers, but they're also important for retirees or people approaching retirement. There still seemed like there were some kind of interesting differences by age and by gender, where it appeared to me, and I'm trying to like do sort of visual regression here, that the uptake was greater for younger, like pre-retirement age men than for the other three groups here. So like that COVID spike is bigger. I didn't take the numbers off and try to regress it, but I thought that was interesting. It wouldn't have been my prior. And so I just thought that might be an interesting thing to look at. Louise's paper, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here just because of the way that I thought the paper is related. Looking at a similarly shaped question, right? How might the safety net respond in the current recession? Focusing on the well-being of people with disabilities, again, a group that we don't typically look at in our research, but again, like really important to inform those things where there are less eyes because they're really important. Louise actually spent a bit of time talking about this interesting uptake and re-entry into the labor market by people with disabilities as a part of like the interesting mechanism that we would want to understand if we were wanting to know in the future, or even understand like right now as we get more data about, well, what's really different about this recession as opposed to prior recessions or just prior periods in general, in terms of what's happening in terms of the safety net's response to people with disabilities. I too found that uptake, that re-entry and sort of more labor force participation by people with disabilities to be interesting. I will just observe that I would speculate about it too. We had seen some similar things in a different piece of research, looking again at sort of like labor market tightness and how is it driving inclusivity of the labor market in general. So this isn't looking at people with disabilities. This is just looking at income growth for families by income quartile. The Fed has this perspective and has sort of been pushing policy along the lines of, well, could we, as the economy was growing prior to the recession, prior to COVID and prior to the COVID recession, but we saw that really tight labor market, might we see the sort of increased labor market inclusivity here shown through income growth? And yes, we do see that. And so I took your speculation, actually edit the slide a little bit while you're talking. Right, like I certainly stand behind your speculation that something like that might be happening with the tightness of the labor market influencing what's happening with disabled people and re-entering the market. And again, super quickly, just running through, Kathleen, your paper is not looking at it, as you point out, it's not really looking narrowly at sort of what's happening with the COVID recession or COVID particularly, but much more like a longer term view. Just the same, the interesting question to me is about, well, yeah, but still, what are we thinking about how the safety net here, more focused on Medicaid and Medicare and healthcare provisioning specifically, as people move into retirement, right? They get old. I get old, I'm getting old. I'm hoping to retire at some point. Right, like you still need to cover your healthcare spending. You still have non-healthcare spending. For those families, for those people who are lower income, like how does that lack of resilience affect their ability to have well-being really through sort of non-healthcare spend? I took as an interesting through line there. And no way to take the argument that you laid out in the detailed simulations and collapse those into a single slide. But the point that I was just trying to remind myself of in this moment was, right, those low-income families, it is great to see that trending down over the last 20 years in terms of the burden that the out-of-pocket healthcare spend is on those families, but just the same, the rest of the paper was the glass half empty. I'm like, well, I would love to think that we can have a policy response that doesn't have that share grow as you draw this chart out, and your simulations certainly show how that turn down could turn into a turn up over the next 50, 75 years or some such. I didn't really have that much to sort of add to that. I thought it was just a really sort of interesting and helpful framing of like what I would want policymakers to pay attention to. The only question that sort of popped into my mind was, when we have looked at healthcare spending, we again haven't really tried to look at it over the long term. We're really much more focused on very, very short-term resilience and sort of responsiveness. We see this huge sensitivity to liquidity in terms of like how people are responding to acute healthcare needs. If I took 1,000 steps back, okay, how could the rest of the safety net maybe sort of lean in and push in to mitigate what might be a real challenge, as it's obviously a super hard problem of keeping sort of healthcare costs down. If my wife is home. Next thing, I'm glad she didn't see me making this. Like, she's a healthcare provider, right? Like I hear about sort of the implication for providers all the time. It's a factor for our family. So it's a really challenging and complicated problem, but it was sort of a question. All of which is to say, like, I did just have sort of two buckets of questions, and they were previewed a bit sort of throughout. One really just like the interplay across the different pieces of the safety net. Like, to do good research, you have to focus on one thing at a time, and really be clear about your mechanism, really be clear about sort of the phenomenon. But when I was trying to make sense of all the papers, I kept thinking, oh, like, how is uptake in this program substituting for uptake in another program? How might the presence of another program mitigate the kinds of things that you might see downstream, as I mentioned on the last slide, is kind of bucket one. And then bucket two, sometimes thinking about macro stuff myself, even in the introduction, I think, Karen, you noted how often we sort of think about this in a very long-term macro way, and it's really important to think about sort of the acute moment of recession, and in the particular very acute recession right now. But I still wanted to like overlay those two things, like how are macroeconomic factors kind of shaping some of the individual mechanics of how people are using the programs.